Oh, Hello, everyone. Good evening, afternoon. Welcome to one more. Sorry, I got distracted. Okay. One more evening of the Open Studios public program here at Jan van Eyck. As usual, we'll have two presentations by two of the current participants. And this evening we'll have Hamza Hassan starting, and then Erin Johnson will follow with a lecture performance. So make sure you stick to watch everything. You can find the whole program online on the Open Studios website, where you can also access the fourth garden, where you can meet some of our participants online. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Hamza Hassan and his guests for the Radical Roundtable Art, Islamophobia, and War on Terror.
Radical roundtables. I think much of the value of the book, Shy Radicals, and the film is sort of that it triggers and inserts itself into very overdue and current and urgent discussions. To me, there's no more urgent discussion than Islamophobia. Just during the time I was at Jan van Eyck Academy, there was a number of deaths that took place, which really struck a chord in my heart. The most tragic being, I mean, not to put them in any order, but was this family who you see in the center, who looked pretty much like my family at home, which is a quite ordinary Canadian Muslim family. Every single one of that family were murdered, apart from the 9-year-old boy, in some Canadian white guy came with a car and drove and murdered them all. And there's a hashtag, our London family, and they're currently fundraising for the little boy who's left alone and will grow up with the trauma of his entire murdered family. A event which reinvented the city for me and reinvented my whole residency was the revitalization of the Palestine Solidarity campaign in this city. And I first came to this city and I thought, oh, Maastricht's one of those towns where, like, if World War III happened, like, nobody would really notice and carry on eating their sort of nice white bourgeois food on terraces. And then the solidarity towards Palestine really reinvented the landscape, the city, the sonic landscape. It sounded differently. My whole network of friendships, just how I thought, and it really made me think that what possibilities of what could happen. And so another thing that really struck me was growing up, and to me it was the red line, was the genocide in Bosnia. I was only a child and a teenager, and on the 11th of July, 1995 was a Srebrenica massacre where the Dutch, by their own courts here in The Hague, were complicit in the mass murder of 8,000 Muslim boys, and partied with the mass murderers and mass rapists afterwards with cans of Heineken. And it was the 25th anniversary of this event. Coming here from Britain and growing up in Britain, I was also quite astonished because within Britain, Srebrenica and the Bosnian genocide is one thing that the entire political spectrum, from the Conservatives to the Labour Party and the Scottish Nationalists, all agree on, and it's used as a memorial day to think about hatred towards minorities. So all institutions within Britain have some sort of memorial day. I think within the Netherlands, the Van Abbe Museum commissioned something for the Bosnian genocide. It wasn't just genocide in terms of murder. Over at least 20,000 Muslim women were raped in rape camps in the years 92 to 95. and some figure goes up to 50,000, but we don't know the full certain amount. But many of those people, the kids of these rape victims, live, thousands of them in their 20s within Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia. And on the same day that the killing took place in Canada, in London, Canada, Ratko Mladic lost his appeal at The Hague, who's one of the architects of that genocide. He still thinks he's fighting a 600-year war against the Ottoman Turks. And I think it's important to remember Bosnia, not just because of the horrors of what happened then, showing solidarity with the mothers and families, but also because you know, the Mein Kampf of our times, which is Andrei Breivik's manifesto, where he massacred 77 people in Norway, mentions Bosnia over 300 times. So he says these Bosnian war criminals are his heroes and his inspiration. And then the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, again, there was Serbian nationalist music playing. And if you look at Golden Dawn or Le Pen in France, they have a very close relationship to the Serb nationalists. And there was a death I actually celebrated a couple of days ago, just recently, which is of Donald Rumsfeld, who's the architect of the torture program in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, but also one of the architects of the war on terror, the infinite war in time and space, which affected my family, but the Iraq War, which killed 1 million Iraqis. So Milan Kundera says the struggle of against unjust powers is the struggle of memory against forgetting. So given I was speaking so much, I sort of wanted to do a 1 minute silence for all these families and horrible deaths. And this was something I printed in the print room, which is the New York Times front page, where all the dead children, the last assault on Gaza, which I used to carry with me around Maastricht. So we're just going to have a 1 minute silence. So how does Islamophobia and the war on terror enter into this discussion around shyness? So within the UK, we have a very extreme form of domestic surveillance, anti-terror policy called the Prevent policy. So essentially, children in primary schools, local hospitals, all aspects of the public sector have a duty to report people for terrorism. And this includes even recently many children as young as 6 and 11 years old. I mean, there was an 11-year-old child who said his ambition in life was to give arms to the oppressed, arms as in charity, and he was reported to his domestic terrorism center and interrogated and humiliated and probably traumatized by the experience. And one of the signs of radicalization, and I don't like using the terms, I feel disturbed that people repeat the frames of unscrupulous neocon think tanks, is these guides here. This is from a real guide here. So, and included being shy or isolated. So one signs of radicalization would include isolating themselves from family and friends, talking as if from a scripted speech, unwilling or inability to discuss their views, a sudden disrespectful attitude towards others, increased levels of anger, which sounds like the average adolescent or how I behave around Jan van Eyck Academy sometimes. And it's disturbing that this enters into this form of police state. Also, now many Muslims who experience mental illness or distress or depression are also seen as signs of a possible pathway towards terrorism. So it's very disturbing. There is a resistance within contemporary art within Britain against many of these policies, and hopefully I'd see that further within Europe and America. So just some examples. Naveen Khan Dosos, who was one of the participants here a couple of years ago, and who I'm very grateful for because she helped on my application to get into Jan van Eyck Academy, and just had a great exhibition at the Van Abbe Museum. And if you go into the Jan van Eyck Academy cafe, you will actually see her mural all around the kitchen cafe area. And she did an amazing show called There Is No Alternative, which she included me as part of. And brought in many voices that would never ever been into contemporary art space before, talking about the war on terror and the experiences. So I could go into gallery and speak about my trauma with my family and my brother. These are a few other artists, Faisal Hussein, making these prevent cakes, and Imran Paretta, who was shortlisted for the Turner Prize during its COVID year, who did this work, The Destructors, about surveillance of Muslim children. And these are some of the experiences I had in London. So this is a really disturbing fascist anti-Muslim rally by the EDL, who are very popular. I mean, this rally, I think, looks like they filled the whole of Trafalgar Square, Downing Street, places where I spent most of my time in the heart of London. And their star speaker was none other than Geert Wilders, who came and supported the campaign. And the picture you see in the corner is the house I lived in when I was at Jan van Eyck Academy. So Geert Wilders' face, a guy who says he wants to ban the Quran, he wants to introduce a raghead tax, thinks Palestine doesn't exist, he calls it just Jordan. And I think that's the mildest of his comments. But yeah, his face is all around my house, the perimeter around my house in Maastricht. There's some very... the person on the left is my friend, Steve, who's an Irish trade unionist. So they slashed his face with a broken beer mug. So, like, yeah, that's what the end result of this free speech, as they call it, is. And I like to take other ways in which I've resisted both the domestic war on terror and whether that's at state level or street level. So I ran this festival for 5 years called DIY Cultures, where I used to read letters from Muslim prisoners or introduce solidarity campaigns. But it was always about creating alliances and coalitions. So this big projected screen, it says respect existence or expect resistance, which you hear often on walls in Palestine, but is used in this instance of anti-gentrification campaign in Brixton. And so there's ways of bringing together. We used to get 2,000 people a day. It was something I felt really proud of. And actually many people came from the Netherlands to this festival. And my book is distributed in this context. It was launched in this context, and it provides part of the discussion. There's a hashtag JVE, Radical One, if anyone's interested. So the thing about zine culture is that it's not reliant on big capital, and it bypasses states and grant bodies and all this sort of bureaucratic, administrative managerialism. So these are some. So there's been a whole burgeoning Muslim subculture around zine culture, which was associated with punk or anarchism or riot girl. And these are some beautiful examples from Britain. So youth stuck between Deen and Dunya, Intifada Milk, about the cows used in Palestine, and Kidda, which I contributed towards, if anyone wants to look at, which is another wonderful journal, Radical, which is a pun of Bradford and Radical. Bradford is the scene of the Asian race riots and Muslim sisterhood. And I guess they're not waiting around for gatekeepers to include them. there's a whole relationship in which you become the central authority rather than wait for someone to include you. This is another one example. are the Muslim female collective who I run DIY cultures with. Sophie Nazi is one of the founders of DIY cultures. And this is the research studio they do in London. It's a community research studio. They also take it around, so they've done it in psychiatric hospitals and worked with other partners. This is on the right is Rose Nordin, who's the designer of Shy Radicals, who does all the beautiful typography and design. And in the center is Sophie Niazi, who I run DIY cultures with. And on the left is Hiba Lamera, who's another one of the editors. And this example of one of their collaborations. So they worked with a primary school with Muslim girls fencing team, looking at the tradition of fencing within Islam. And this is actually done on a Riso print. I think it'd be great if Joe invited them to be part of Jan van Eyck's Riso internationalism. And these are some of the other examples. Theresa May is the very repressive Home Secretary who signed the order to put my brother in a death row prison and extradite him in a racist double standard way. And there's also a lot of humor in terms of this resistance. So snog, marry or deport here. And for those, because many people aren't in Britain, the thing I'm more famous for within the UK is running a campaign for my brother. So my brother was ripped from our family home in the year 2006, put into maximum security prisons without trial, charge or evidence at the request of the United States, a country none of us in my family had been to or ever set foot until my brother was shipped there in a death row prison for marginal association with a series of obsolete websites around the wars in Bosnia, Chechnya and Afghanistan, which was obsolete for a number of years at the time of his arrest. And it created a lot of controversy within Britain because other extradition cases of people, my brother was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and had excess life risk. And yeah, he was not saved, but people with the same life risk were saved who were white British citizens. So it created this two standards of citizenship. The whole archive of the campaign is actually online on freethaler.org. And this was some of the campaign material. And something I've been doing at Jan van Eyck Academy is sort of sorting out through these. My brother was freed in 2014, but there's 8 years of material. And some of the other times, so that's Theresa May, and that's me, and some of the people involved in those campaigns. And it was just part of the wider campaigns against austerity or imperialism. As you see Jeremy Corbyn there on the left, the best Prime Minister Britain ever had. And because you notice in Islamophobic news stories, there's always a mention of, say, the benefit system, or in my brother's case, what legal aid was. And at the same time, the Conservative government would have a war against these forms of basic welfare state provisions and rights, so attacking the universalism of them as rights. And I think of the war on terror as a longer thing. So many people who supported our campaign included former Black Panthers. So that earlier war against Black dissident movements and leftist movements from the 50s is something that ally with. This is the rally I get referred to in the film I'm about to show. I think one of the most important things is just remembrance. I do, as part of the ongoing campaign for my brother since he's been 3, this is one event I did on the Bosnian genocide in London. And it's just important to, people younger than the age of 30 tend to not even know what that is. The news stories of Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic's verdicts barely create a blip, despite the horror of what they did. And there's also, my parents are originally the Muslim minority in India, where we're originally from. And I think now, and I think Manjo's work is very related to this, but the state of democracy in India, but also the state of violence against Muslim minorities in India. So you have lynchings on Muslims who eat beef and so forth. So Reclaim Diwali was a event that my brother was part of, and is part of my activist community in London. So I'd like to introduce a short film by one of the most eloquent voices of our generation, Sahaya Manzu Khan. And this was originally cut for the Shy Radicals film. So for the Shy Radicals film, which some of you watched, and I hope many of you watch in the future, which is adaptation of the book, that we shot at least several feature films, but like there was so much footage. So this is Sahaya Manzu Khan. I'd actually like to say hello to everyone. The Home Office is the part of the government which deals with immigration and crime, just to put some context. And I've already mentioned what the Prevent strategy was. So this was originally made for a reading room in London, a free word centre, which had an archive of campaigns from the 70s until now. But I think we just play that now.
So when I come to the Home Office, I feel like doing this like the deepest, most exhausted sigh. Because you just come here so many times. Like I've come here for so many visuals, for so many deportations, for so many cruelties, for all the war and terror abuses, for all the civil liberty abuses. I was here. I did a big welcome home rally for my brother here with people from across generations.
That's amazing. How does it feel now though when you're here? Like, does it feel bleak or does it feel like, how do those
you
memories
still have
make
to
you
be
feel?
here, so I mean the oppressive, violent aspect of this place, like you never stop feeling it and you never feel safe from it ever.
Yeah, that's actually, well, you know what you were saying about like hope, like you think that we're hopeful. Like for me, that element of like resilience in that, the fact that just even what you just said then about like you still have to come back.
Yeah.
To me, there's nothing more hopeful than that. Like that takes a lot of
I
resilience.
actually feel really broken. Like when I went to your book launch, you're full of this sense of love and optimism and wholeness. I'm not. I feel quite a broken, exhausted, like messed up person.
But don't you think that's what they do? Like that's not an accident that you feel that way. Do you know what I mean? Like it's like almost a strategy of the state that of course you would feel broken at this stage.
And I sort of brought all of that in the book. Like I was thinking about the security state and how we're co-opted and how all movements are co-opted. And I even mentioned the Prevent strategy, the state surveillance thing. So the Shy Radicals movement is monitored by Prevent.
Yeah, I love that. And also because what I quite liked is this idea that what I like that you kind of trade, because there's some things, there is a parallel between almost the way that like, I think what you were saying earlier, where it's like being Muslim is seen as so inherent. It's inherent. You do everything wrong. You do gender wrong. You do social norms wrong. You do etiquette wrong. You do everything wrong. And I think I did feel that parallel in your book, where it's like the shy peoples of the world are just always. I mean, more than anything, it's that you're non-normative. It's that you're not. You're not.
But I think there's something about hedonism, though, that's seen as the sort of peak of freedom and human liberation. And like when they invade Afghanistan or they occupy Palestine or like try and change social norms or what's average and normal and everyday for us.
No,
it's because we're not Islam. Our parents aren't going to go out and get drunk and something, and by them not doing that, it's almost like they're bad migrants.
100%,
like,
yeah, absolutely.
Or they're bad people.
100%, and
it's
like
that's not viewed as another way of being. It's just viewed as they're repressed or they're not good enough or civilized enough 100%. To partake in this.
Absolutely, and I think that's the really interesting, the obsession with the hijab and like Muslim women's bodies is that all plays out on that, right? It's like your refusal to as you say, partake in like this definition of liberation, which by virtue is also about, it's kind of, or implicitly about like a sexual liberation that is also a linked to sort of like fun, you know, these words, I don't know, these words like fun, enjoyment, you know, and people will say things like live your life, like your best life, YOLO, these kind, do you know what I mean? It's this kind of discourse. But on the other hand, and that's why I really like that bit about niqabis and like this idea that actually there is something that is so disruptive, clearly to the norm, by just covering some aspect of your face or your body, you've somehow created this moment of absolute like collapse to that order, because it doesn't make sense.
I feel there's something in the hatred of I mean, people used to really bully me and like gang up on me because I was quiet. And like the reason I think is because this idea of being unknowable.
Yes, 100%.
So I thought of it more deeply in terms of when we think of colonial violence and its roots in the Enlightenment, we're thinking about this desire to know everything.
100%.
Everything has to be knowable. Even when like something's in the British Museum, it's like ripped from its religious origin. So it's like.
But it reminds me of that Frantz Fanon quote where he says that the Algerian Muslim woman, like the problem that she poses is that she refuses to be seen, refuses to be known, and that is the desire to uncover her, to unveil her, is that desire to know, to see, and to make knowable, which is, I think, what you're saying.
Why can't some people be just content with not knowing? Like,
This is,
they don't. Why do you have to have like there always has to be some sort of explanation for why a woman would choose to wear a niqab, and maybe sometimes we just have to assert our right to be unknowable.
Yeah, no, and I actually think that's one of the most powerful things, because for me, I think we're always, and I see this a lot in spoken word poetry actually. You see, something that frustrates me, I guess, amongst the younger generation that I see is like, there's always this desire to be like, I am not what you think I am this thing. And I actually agree with you that there's so much more power in saying, I just am. And I'm not, do you know what I mean? And actually to not go through that. Exactly, not explaining ourselves, not justifying ourselves.
I feel, like there are some incredibly brave niqabi women going on the mainstream TV and showing they don't fit the stereotypes and they study science and they're like super articulate. But it's like, well, they don't have to be, and not everyone is, and that's fine.
And I think for me it's that thing of, who's that for? And that is for a white gaze, and that is for an audience that just wants to consume your experiences. And for me, it's actually almost more powerful, I would say, to just not. And I think because really then you partake in this idea that our humanity is conditional, and we will fulfill those conditions. And in a way, I don't know, I kind of feel this sad sense of like, when you do those appearances or whatever, you kind of justify the idea that, but there are some niqabis who are backwards, there are some who are submissive, and then therefore they do deserve that treatment, and they are kind of uncivilized. And I worry that we just reinforce. It always reminds me of that Toni Morrison quote where she says that one of the very real functions of racism is distraction, and it's like we're spending all this time proving our existence, justifying it, explaining it, when actually maybe what's much more powerful is to exist and just continue without explaining. And we see that continuously frustrates.
I think that the good Muslim polices as much as the bad one does.
Yeah, that's
the
very
limits
real.
of what we can say and what's acceptable.
I think about that a lot. What does that, as someone who, and you as well, people who use like writing as a means to express ourselves. Because I'm just saying this because there's that bit in Shy Radicals where you basically controversially say that Audre Lorde says your silences will not protect you, but Audre Lorde was wrong. And that really stuck with me, because I think that's really interesting, because for so long I'm definitely someone who's been like so inspired by that kind of, but then in the in a real securitized state, right, where I actually live, where prevent is a real thing, and where like I know people are policed and surveilled, it's kind of, I don't know, I was just thinking about this, like, do your silences protect you? And then I almost feel that for me, Islam is like the reason that that almost doesn't matter, because it's like, I don't know what you think about this, but I almost think there's something also very about that whole hedonism. You know, you were saying about hedonism and extrovert supremacy. I think the reason Islam also poses this kind of threat is that it's a whole different standard by which to measure your worth, your actions, and that is something that I definitely feel is disruptive. For you to just say so confidently and so boldly, like, oh, I don't do that, I don't go there, I don't want to do that.
For my generation, like, the Iraq War was the entry point into like a lot of activism and rethinking government and the state. But there were some Iraq war protests, which was just like carnivals. You just had these clowns and these like drums. It's almost like they're celebrating death. And then I thought it was far more dignified to just like walk in silence. Like the Grenfell protests, they just walk in silence together.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's the way death should be mourned.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite more powerful.
Yeah.
Like tens of thousands of people being silent.
Absolutely.
It's like,
No, absolutely. That's so powerful.
where else in life would you
Exactly.
pause and do that?
Welcome back, Naveen Khan-Dossos, to Jan van Eyck Academy. Naveen? Welcome back. I'm going to be a really strict chair on everyone, so everyone's going to stick to like 6 minutes maximum. But yeah, welcome back, Naveen. I hope it feels great to be back.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Hamza for inviting me to be part of this discussion. It is really wonderful to be back in the Jan van Eyck, if just as embodied in a screen and not in person, and I hope I will be there in person one day very soon. Yeah, I mean, I met Hamza in the context of this show that I worked on in 2019 and the 2 years prior to that, called There Is No Alternative. And I think actually Hamza gave a really eloquent description of what Prevent is. And I'm very interested in these kind of, not just the role of terrorism in the kind of culture, the everyday culture of that I've certainly grown up with since 9/11, which I think Hamza and I sort of share in terms of our age and things we've been exposed to. But also this idea of the pre-criminal space and what that means to be able to or not able to define a crime or a criminal before it's happened. And it's quite a kind of sci-fi term in a way. But what I wanted to do is, because we have a very short amount of time, instead of kind of going into what that show is about, I wanted to take this opportunity to describe an event that happened to me after the show at the showroom in London, where I met Hamza, which I've not really talked about publicly before, but can now, and well, I want to. After the show happened, which was There Is No Alternative, was an attempt to make a response to the independent review of the Prevent programme, which is ongoing and should finish this summer. It was not in direct dialogue, but happening in parallel. And after the show happened, I was invited by email to meet Lord Carlisle, who at the time was the independent reviewer, or the kind of heading up the review. And I was invited into his office to come and talk about the exhibition and the archive I created, and the impact of the exhibition and the workshops that we'd had, and I guess have a discussion with him. And it was a very difficult decision to make, because a lot of people that I know and respect have made the call, and I think rightly so, not to engage with the government's independent review of Prevent. But I decided to go for my own reasons. I thought it was an important thing to do. And for me, that discussion, which is what I want to tell you about very briefly, was really important because, and it's really stayed with me and took me a long time to digest, because after I discussed with Lord Carlisle the nature of the project that I'd worked on and the nature of the type of resistance that I was interested in and the criticisms of Prevent that I had and I shared with many other people who I've worked with and care a lot about their views and yeah, share in the kind of struggle to have a critical voice around these government measures, is that he said something to me. One was that he, first of all, told me that he was very interested in contemporary art and cited Anthony Gormley as as conceptual art and somebody he was very interested in. And then said that the reason he was interested in Anthony Gormley was because of the objectivity of his art. And he basically began this very weird philosophical conversation with me around the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. And that as an artist, and even though he described Anthony Gormley as quite an objective artist, as an artist, I was subjective and therefore unempirical in some way. and that the role of government and of the independent review was to be objective and not subjective. And it was this really kind of weird and complex discussion about basically whose view was kind of important, and the difference of this kind of scientific objectivity and what it meant to have like a subjective, independent, emotional, you know, whatever it is, voice that I was presenting as an artist, but also that he was implying were a lot of the types of voices that were criticizing Prevent. And for me, this also just came down to a fundamental misunderstanding of what subjective experience. And I think that he totally missed the point of that. Like, even though Prevent acts as a counter-terrorism measure that is supposed to be carried out across a large portion of British society, actually the experience of Prevent, whether you're the person who is on the receiving end of it or the person who feels obliged to call somebody in or feels pressured to perform this kind of surveillance, is an inherently subjective experience, and one that stays with people for a very long time, and can be incredibly damaging and traumatic, as Hamza has said. And I left that meeting just feeling really bewildered. And it really took me a very, very long time to come to terms with just the weirdness of what this encounter had been, and just also fundamentally, I was like, I cannot engage. There's no engagement with this because there's no understanding of this difference between the hierarchy of objectivity and subjectivity. But that the only thing we must do is to carry on fighting and fighting in the ways that Hamza and many other people who are actively involved in this drive to find other ways, well, not to stop Prevent in its tracks. So I'm just going to leave it there because time is running out. But I just really wanted to share that one experience in my short period of time. And
thank you so much, Naveen. Actually, Lord Carlisle was
a very important one.
Lord Carlisle was one of the rotten establishment bastards who did double standards on my brother and was actually complicit in his extradition. So I wouldn't be surprised if he took a interest. You should really check out Naveen's work and her book. This is which will be out soon. Next, I'd like to welcome Malia Buwata. Malia Buwata is an inspiration to me. She was the first Arab Muslim woman to be elected president of the National Union of Students. And she's the editor of a wonderful British leftist magazine called Red Pepper. And someone's really broken the glass ceiling. She's worked with me in solidarity when my brother was in prison as a student activist, and does some of the best journalism on Islamophobia in the Netherlands, which we'll talk about now.
Thank you, Hamza. Thank you for hosting me and for organizing this very important event. I feel slightly like the imposter who doesn't come from an art background, but actually you're the one who served as an inspiration for many of us back in the UK, particularly in our fight against racism and state repression in all its forms. So thank you. I think that I'll try to stick to the time, but I just wanted to start by saying that in reality across Europe, it seems the same story of rising racism and a growing far right gaining more legitimacy and seats of power is our current reality, and states across the continent are peddling Islamophobia in particular in order to justify their continued so-called war on terror, which seeks to narrow everyone's civil liberties, target political dissent, and introduce mass surveillance through policing and technology. And whilst there are differences between Muslim oppression and the history of engagement between the British and Dutch states with these communities, the aims and practices of both are ideologically aligned. During the COVID-19 pandemic, which the Netherlands' response to wasn't exactly a shining example, since infections were skyrocketing and there was a crisis over access to hospital beds and vaccines, the government still seemed to find the time and the resources to heighten its targeting of Muslims. And amidst a second national lockdown, a policy calling on intensified repression and surveillance of Muslims, namely through mosques, was overwhelmingly voted through. In fact, the only party, the overwhelmingly Muslim Denk, were the ones to vote against. And this means, and what this policy now means is that mosques will face further monitoring over foreign influence. Their finances will be under even heavier state scrutiny, and the law was, like I said, was passed virtually unremarked and unopposed. Muslim organizations and institutions in the Netherlands could now face being shut down or have their funding curbed if they're accused of undesirable behavior. You could say, what on earth does that mean? But knowing the state practices, we know what that means. This follows the establishment of a parliamentary interrogation committee on unwanted influence from unfree countries, which last year issued a report describing how external, so non-EU countries, were controlling Dutch mosques through often unaccountable money streams. Now the Dutch authorities will have more power to block these foreign influences and reprimand institutions through penalties. There's more than a little irony, I'd say, that the argument seems to be that more state control is needed to fight state control. And this is all in addition to the already racist backdrop of the so-called war on terror in the Netherlands, which has, similarly to the UK, depending on increased surveillance, the implication of public sector workers across education, welfare and policing in order to spy on Muslims and de-radicalize them, or through the stripping of citizenship to discard those suspected or convicted on terror charges. And just as in Britain, when the narrative under David Cameron became defending supposed British values as a means of justifying the further institutionalizing of racist counter-extremism practices, the Dutch state also adopts this approach. These values, whether British or Dutch, whilst remaining extremely vaguely defined and relying heavily on racialized assumptions of what is or isn't included in them, seem inextricably linked to the weakening of civil liberties and the targeting of dissent. The state calls on Muslim institutions to refrain from any critique of it and its foreign policy, imposing a depoliticized religious agenda and collaborating with the state forces by accepting heavy surveillance and information gathering amongst the community. And it's striking, for example, that whilst punishing mosques for receiving funding from non-free states, the Netherlands continues to impose dual citizenship on its Moroccan population, for example, strengthening the control that the Moroccan crown continues to have over them, as well as the religious and political networks linked to it. Unfortunately, historically, Muslim institutions in the Netherlands have been considerably more prepared to engage with the state and its repressive laws than necessarily in the UK. And this explains a lot about the sense that there is much less engagement, resistance, and mobilization that takes place here than in the UK, where coalitions between Muslims, trade unions, students, and academics, healthcare professionals, and a vast base of political activists has long existed in opposition to the counter-extremism agenda of the government. And the vacuum can, of course, not only be put at the door of the Muslim communities, whereas there's been a history of mass mobilizations amongst trade unions, social movements, left-wing organizations, and even sections of the Labour Party in solidarity with Muslims at home and abroad in the UK. the Dutch left has been extremely reluctant to address the issue of Islamophobia and to build connections between the anti-racist struggle and the defense of civil liberties for all. The fact that the so-called left parties would vote en masse in favor of the laws targeting mosques, for example, without any dissenting voices, captures the political reality quite powerfully. And this is all very contradictory to the image that the Netherlands likes to portray to the world, that it defends freedoms and human rights. And whether it's through the denial of such repression, that such repression takes place in the country, or through the dependence on a left that has also internalized the view that Muslims are a suspect community which must be controlled, there is a worryingly low level of opposition or even critique of the Dutch war on terror. In the UK, many understood early on that the trend which soon follows these Muslim-specific laws and practices is the targeting of all political opposition and the silencing of progressive groups and spaces. And we saw, for example, prevent policies targeting Marxist lecturers, anti-capitalist teachers, anti-fracking activists, as well as pro-Palestine actions. What was tested out on Muslims first fast became a standard practice across the board. And there's an argument that we need, there's an argument that there's a need for us here in the Netherlands to rebuild these practical connections in the face of an ever increasing repressive state and a rising far right. And as we start, we could do with highlighting the double standards in what the state says and what it actually does. And in the Netherlands, the far right, which actively incites hatred and violence upon Muslims and migrants, is normalized to the extent that the far right party for freedom that you mentioned, Hamja, led by Wilders, can openly stand in an election calling on the banning of mosques, Qurans, and Islamic schools, and for the establishment of a ministry of repatriation and de-Islamification without being challenged, met with demonstrations everywhere he goes, or shunned from polite political debate. And the fact that his is a leading parliamentary party highlights the dangers of allowing such politics to go unchallenged. And as long as nothing is done to oppose such far-right forms of extremism, it will continue to grow, shape the political arena, and pull the entire centre ground to the right. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for waking us all up, Malia. I think me and some of the other participants go to Maastricht Mosque, and we would actually now should be more alert to what's going on. I'd like to now introduce Hassan Vada, who affectionately called Tate Sheikh. He works at Tate Modern and Tate Britain and does an amazing PhD at Goldsmiths looking at, you'll tell us all about your amazing PhD at Goldsmiths. He's just one of my best friends as well in London.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah for that, Hamza. I don't think I can ever live up to that status of the Tate Sheikh in your mind, but I'm really grateful for you to be holding this space, because it's quite interesting that along with such esteemed peers, because it's really interesting that a space like this where Islamophobia, war and terror, and its relation to art is given time to be discussed, and that it feels refreshing, or it feels almost unique being held within this art institution, despite there being so much exhibition and reference to Islam in art galleries, in museums over the last century, and really profoundly over the last decades. Just there's so much exhibition of Islam, yet the war on terror, Islamophobia, these are missing topics, and that's why something like DIY Cultures has done more activity there on the conversations we're having than all the public, the £1 million institutions put together in Britain. I would confidently say. It really speaks to how disconnected the art world has been to these immediate conversations and experiences of being Muslim, and the pressures and the harms that come from all the political, social, and cultural pushes that has made Muslims this suspect community, UK, Dutch context, across Europe. Just how little the art space the institutionalized art space has attempted to engage with this Muslim question, and the way Muslims have just been pushed forward as the death of multiculturalism. So my research, that Hamza alluded to, the doctoral research, is looking at how Muslims in Britain are considered by the art museum and institution and cultural institutions of Britain. How Muslims are framed, or more specifically, how they're unframed or even not even considered as living, existing communities with presence in Britain or in Europe. And with that, it comes with the consideration of how Islam has been framed within these museums themselves, because whilst the living presence might not be there, it definitely has a confidence when speaking about Islam, or what kind of Islam it wants to put forward. And whilst I speak from this research from a British context, I do think that the cultures of the art world, or the art museum and the art gallery space in general, are very similar, and they all draw from the same river across the world. Really, I kind of see them in the context of this work as these pseudo-secular embassies of liberal conscious clearing. I mean, using the term a lot, like the art museum and the curatorial club as this Jannat al-Firdaus of liberal conscious clearing. There's this strong language of inclusion. There's so much talk on decolonization, so much talk on anti-racism, whilst there might not be the action always to back that up. It's also interesting that something like Islamophobia is never foregrounded in many of these institutions that have this language of inclusion that they put forward so often.
Thank you. I'm sorry, just time is just running out. So there's loads of insight. Look at the hashtag #TateShake if you want to learn. So just to close for the final voice is one of the best white men I met in my life. My friend Luke, he runs a voice from speaking to us from Brussels, Belgium. He runs this amazing leftist publisher called Antidote, which publishes amazing stuff on Islamophobia, the war on terror, prisoners, Black Lives Matter. And we've worked together as prison activists against solitary confinement, and I've often used the arts too. So Luke, please go give the closing words to you. You've got 5 minutes. Unmute yourself, Luke. I think we can't hear you. You unmute your mic. There you go.
I'm sorry. You see, it's a transgenerational meeting, as you see there, because
I see a picture of Ali Ras in the back as well.
Yeah, he's there. He's always there.
There's a Moroccan Belgian citizen who we both campaigned for. He was a sister campaign of my brother's campaign. Luke will tell you more about Ali Ras. He's free now, though.
Yeah, he is. So thanks again for inviting me for your transgenerational and transnational event. You put it, I will tell the public a bit more about our meeting in London, which is for me a very important moment when I met you a couple of years ago. I add something about Belgium, because you put the event in the frame of British and Dutch countries, but so I'm speaking a bit about Belgium, which is this little country at the North Sea, as you know, which is also the headquarters of NATO. It's the headquarters of the European institutions and so on. So in my country, as in most countries in Europe, the fascist consequences of the participation in the war on terror are often hidden for the public and also accepted by the public by the fear that has been installed since 20 years and that's been hammered in the minds of what they call the public opinion. So Belgium is taking part in the war on terror in Afghanistan, in Niger, in Iraq. So this is all things that not much people know. So maybe a first point for me, terrorism has become the same thing as violence committed by Muslims whom the West disliked. So you talked about Anders B. Breivik in Utoya in Norway. This is not seen as terrorism, it's seen as extremism. But terrorism is like linked and immediately identified as being Muslim. That's maybe a very important thing for young people who hear, who has been hammered in heads that this is the same thing. So I think it's very important to see how since 2 decades now this opinion has been formed. You know, that's one thing. For me, as a former prison teacher, I think that the war on terror radically changed our political and judicial culture in our countries, and it really meant a U-turn in the carceral conditions in our countries, not only in the US but also in Europe. So I think that things like rendition, like practice of torture, solitary confinement, creating spaces outside our own countries and our own law is what this war on terror brought us. You see, for instance, the voices in France to create our Guantanamo in Europe has been heard since, let's say, since the attacks in Paris. So they talked about creating Guantanamo in an island called Ile de Ré. It was a serious proposition. It's not just something they invented. Denmark, they proposed to create a space for refugees on the Lindholm Island, which is a place where they formerly had animals who were sick or who were tested, and now they want to put refugees there who have to be expelled from Denmark. You have the model of Australia that's coming more and more and was cited by the right party here in Belgium called the N-VA, the National Flemish Alliance, which is now one of the biggest parties in Belgium, who say that what they do in Australia with refugees on Manus Island or at Nauru, so we have to apply the same practices here. We have also the DRADEX sections in 2 prisons in Belgium, and we have this tendency now to, and what I call the Guantanamoization of our concept, is that we have to expel incarceration towards countries of the South, outside of our own national borders, like Britain wants to install prisons in Nigeria. Belgium and Austria demand to Morocco to be allowed to create a prison for prisoners who are from Moroccan nationality or others. So this is what I call the big leap backwards since we have this war on terror since 2 decades. And it created also a new form of McCarthyism, this time not against communists, but against all what they call Islamo-gauchists in our language. I don't know how you translate it in English, but the people who try to uphold some elementary form of justice and humanity. I lost my job as a teacher in prisons in 2009 because I was involved in the campaign not to extradite Nizar Trabelsi. Nizar Trabelsi is a Tunisian who had a plan to commit an attack, a bomb attack against an American base here in Belgium. It was a plan, and he was convicted to 10 years for that. But afterwards, the Americans said, we want him too. And so they filled an extradition demand, which was accepted by Belgium against the advice of the European Court not to extradite Trabelsi. They did it anyway, illegally. And so I'm talking about the period he was locked up in 2002. He did his his incarceration in Belgium for 10 years, and then he was extradited to the United States. He's now, since nearly 8 years, in solitary confinement in the United States, waiting for his trial there, and which means that he is since 20 years imprisoned for a plan that never took place. You know, so I will finish with my meeting with you in London. I was with Jean-Marc Mailly, who is a former detainee, and he spent 3 years in solitary confinement in Luxembourg, which is even a more little country than Belgium. And he made a play on his experience on solitary confinement, where he was for 3 years as a young detainee. And we were looking for a theater in London to show the piece also there with English subtitles. And we didn't find a way out, and we couldn't find anyone who could produce the thing. And I remember entering a pub where Hamza was at his computer. I think he didn't even look at us very well. He just said, "Okay, I'll do it." And he just found us a place where we could perform the piece. It was just shown only once in London. But this is what, for me, the shy radical Hamza Hassan is. He's a man of action. He doesn't need too many words, even if he speaks very well. But he's just a man who goes into action. And then I had the occasion to participate in his campaign, a little bit in his campaign, which I think was a remarkable campaign against solitary confinement. I remember we were together at university in London. It was an activity also organized by Penny Green, Liz Fikete, and we had a common event on with a little film on...
Sorry, I'm going to have to just cut you off because we've really run out of time. There's someone after us. So that meeting which Luke referred to, it's online. It's called Extradited to a Future of Torture, and you can find it on YouTube. If you're interested in these issues in the French and Dutch language, do check out the Antidote publishers. I'd like to thank all the speakers, Malia, Naveen, Hassan, Luke. There's a hashtag JVE Radical1. Do that on Twitter or Instagram, and you will be able to contribute more to the discussion because it needs an extended discussion. I'd lastly just like to say there's 2 practical tips I'd like to give every institution and curator and arts venue in dealing with Islamophobia. One, mark the 11th of July, the EU Day for remembering the Bosnian genocide of Muslims in some institutional capacity. And 2, everyone of humanity should sign BDS, the peaceful, unified call by the Palestinians to show them solidarity and not cross their picket line, which virtually no one does in the Netherlands, but a lot of us in Britain, the United States, and the world do. And lastly, I hope we can all unify together and defeat Islamophobia, imperialism, Zionism, and racism, and live in a better world.
Thank you so much to all of you for all of your amazing contributions. We definitely need more time, but tomorrow there's a final Radical Roundtable with Hamza and other guests. So thank you very much, Hamza, for today, and looking forward for tomorrow. And those of you online are also invited. But please do stick around. In 10 minutes, we have a performance by Aaron Johnson, To Be Sound is to Be Solved. So see you in a bit. Hello, welcome back. Where are my claps? That's more like it. Thank you very much. Thanks. Welcome back. So now I have the pleasure to have with me Erin Johnson, a current Jan van Eyck participant, and Charlotte Brager, who is joining us online. And I think I'll just hand it over to you and Charlotte for your lecture performance. Okay. To be sound is to be solid. How's it? To be sound is to be solid. I just had to stress my memory. To be sound is to be solid. Take it away. Okay, thank you, everyone. I want to thank Charlotte for joining us from New York, and we've been working on a project together. Charlotte is the DP and the editor on the project, and it's a work in progress, and so we thought tonight might be a nice moment to kind of merge both some writings about the work, some interviews that we've done to make the work, and then also to kind of get some feedback on the work as it's in progress. And so this isn't in its final form in any way, but a kind of way for us to iterate and work towards something. So thanks for joining us. So yeah, I think, Charlotte, do you want to say anything?
No, it's nice to be in the Netherlands for a second.
Yeah, welcome. So maybe we can go ahead and cue the video. Oh, can we restart and have the sound on? Sorry, thank you. I saw a fox in the front yard. It was New Year's Day and it seemed like a good sign. The fox was walking around in the grass on the hill near the garage, and then it caught a mouse, or maybe a mole, I couldn't see, and then just ran off. I opened the front door, and over the course of the month that I stayed there, I rarely looked back at the patch of land where the fox once stood. Almost all of the windows were on one side of the house, pointing towards the sea. Arts patron Mary Lee Smart and artist Beverly Hallam designed and built the modernist house in 1971 and lived there together for over 40 years. It's very much a house made for two. Until Charlotte joined me, I slept with the lights on, the presence of the long twisting corridor that connects what is now called Beverly's side and Mary's side, always palpable.
In Opacity in the Closet, Nicolas de Villiers constructs the binary of being in or out of a closet through the idea of queer opacity. For an object to be opaque, it is visibly present, but obscured in some way. Instead of seeing opaque tactics as a way to hide the truth, they are the truth themselves. Despite this, we spent our mornings sifting through their journals, travelogues, and paperwork, trying to find a sentence that would validate our speculation that Beverly and Mary were romantic partners, and that having 2 bedrooms, 2 kitchens, 2 dining rooms was all to throw people off their track. But the closest thing to proof is the slipperiness of the language used in many of the architectural drawings that they drew in preparing to build their home. Sometimes one of the bedrooms is labeled master and the other guest. In another drawing, one is Beverly's and the other Mary's. In one drawing, there is only one clear bedroom.
I'm in the house. We met with an part of the international team working to make the world seabed by 2030. We ate fried fish sandwiches on a patio overlooking the rocky coast of Maine, just an hour from Surf Point House. Since then, we've been having conversations by phone. These recordings will eventually be part of the video's audio, but for today, we'll just read these excerpts aloud.
If you could go down to the bottom of the ocean floor and walk on it, and in many places you actually couldn't really walk on it because it would be very gooey with soft, sticky mud. But if you could, you would see things. Depending on where you were, you might actually see really dramatic topography, particularly where there's active tectonic seafloor spreading, where tectonic plates split at their boundaries and then slowly move away from each other. And then hot magma bubbles up and glides into the fractures and is cooled by seawater. And this makes new rock. The seafloor is constantly shifting by creating and destroying itself.
So yeah, you'd have to get that close to see it and have this human perception of what landscape looks like and feels like to really get a sense of it. But most of the depth measurements we have are made from surface ships with echo sounding. But the ocean is so deep that the best you can do with that from a surface ship gives you the average depth is a patch that is, in the deep ocean, at best, maybe 100 meters by 100 meters, more likely 200 by 200. And anyway, we have this high-tech state-of-the-art data and it's accurately located. It also tends to be over and over and over again in the same few places because of the ships. And the rest of the ocean remains unexplored. What I'm trying to say is that half of the area of the Earth's ocean floor is more than 6 miles from the nearest depth measurement. So yeah, things can hide if you just use sounding measurements.
By the way, I should explain, when we take a measurement of depth, we call it a sounding. To sound something, how can I put this? To be sound is to be solid or cohesive, holding together. When people first started probing for where the ocean bottom was, initially it was done with a long pole. When it hit the bottom, you'd hit something sound. That's how depth were measured first, with a body.
The places where we've measured depth in the ocean cover the oceans about as densely or sparsely as the interstate highway system of the United States land surface. And people are going to use that map for all kinds of things. They're going to use it to try to understand geology, habitat, weather patterns, where they might explore for natural resources, where they might want to protect habitats and environments. What would be a good route for a pipeline or a railroad or a highway, all kinds of things like that. And you're going to produce that map, and everyone's going to take that map and use it and believe that it's true or correct. But the problem is that you're going to have to create that map from measurements that were only taken along the interstate highways and nowhere else. So that you don't have any data in the Grand Canyon, you don't have any data in the Yosemite National Park. You've only got a few crossings of the western US, things like that. So imagine how right or wrong the map is in all of those things.
If you're going to draw a map, you have to take a curved surface and flatten it onto a piece of paper. You have to make distortions, and you have to choose what distortions to make. If you're going to be honest about area, you have to lie about shape. If you're going to be honest about shape, you have to lie about area. If you want the distances between things to be true, they can only be true in a certain direction, perspective, and so forth.
So when Marie Tharp was making the first ever complete map of the ocean floors in the late 70s and helping to prove the idea that continents move over time, she wasn't just saying, here's the data, but she was really saying, I'm going to portray my vision of what's going on. And I'm going to draw it in a way that implies the processes are going on. And so it's only loosely tied to the actual measurements of depth that I have. But I'm going to make this argument that the ocean floor, that we ought to think of it this way when we imagine it in our heads. It's not really a map of data, it's more of a mental picture. So Marie was making these visual arguments and having to interpolate across the enormous gaps because there's very little data. Even today, there's only a few % of the ocean where we actually have measurements of depth. How do we map something we haven't measured? What is measured? And what will the maps show in the unmeasured places? And then, of course, how right or wrong are the maps that we have? And does it matter?
Our friend is an architect, and she offered to give us a tour of the house from afar. We like imagining her walking from room to room and down the long corridor, describing the elements of the house drifting in and out of earshot like the tides. For the video, we will eventually record her in the house, but for today, we will just read some excerpts from our conversations.
We in architecture pedagogy almost only look at floor plans, and especially with modernism. They'll say, oh, what an amazing floor plan it is. Because the very thing that makes modernism functional is the fact that this idea of walking from one place to another, like getting here quickly, getting there quickly. and the floor plan making sense. It's purely just functionality, the house as machine, and this idea of just rejecting everything that's not absolutely necessary. If there's one thing that modernism dominates, it's that everything revolves, everything is movable, everything is operable. And so if something is going to be modernist, it has to be about openness and visibility and functionality. It's always going to be 360. And so it's quite rare to have a modernist example that would be one-sided and not radiating or centrifugal towards all sides.
Modernists like Le Corbusier wanted to reorientate the corridor as a passage of light and transparency. But this space is without the ocean, without windows. It's like it's seeking refuge. What modernism often doesn't give you, which is darkness or privacy or something hidden, is reclaimed here. Here in this in-between space, this connector between things, this is where the house comes together. If they were a couple and slept in the same bedroom, then they didn't need 2 bedrooms. And then it's like modernism undermining itself because they have to have that so that it looks proper. And so it's this anti-modernist move that is made necessary by the very rules of modernism. If it had in that time been acceptable just for a lesbian couple to live in this house, then they wouldn't have to go counter to the architectural laws of modernism, only having one of each and not being functional in that way. If they're going to be partners or a couple, if there's this idea of symmetry or complementarity, or that that there's redundancy, that there are 2 bedrooms, but actually there's only using 1.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we just really wanted to kind of use this time, and maybe Bruno, you'll MC the situation, but as a time to just, hear thoughts on any of these things that the excerpts from these conversations bring up for you, like if there's things that you're thinking about or wondering about, or questions that you have for us, but also just resources that you want to share, or anything. That's why we would like to show a work in progress, because it's nice to be able to chat about it. So thank you, everyone, for listening.
It's not so much a question or a comment even, maybe just 2 fragments of information that came to my head when I was listening.
Yes.
The first one was, I think, maybe a reference known to a few people in the beginning of this one Borges story, where he talks about this map, maybe you know it, a society that was so obsessed with making accurate maps that they ended up making a map that was the size of the actual territory. And so, I guess, suffocated the entire society. I mean, he intimates it by saying that ruins of it are still visible in some deserts. And then the second fragment is Arawaka and Jin's, this architecture duo from Japan, and I think maybe one of them is American. But they have this place called the Site of Reversible Destiny. And they had this, actually came up in my mind with this idea of this corridor, right, this winding corridor. And they were saying that if you create an architecture that is so impossible to navigate through, that it will reset the relative position in which you understand time. So they made this one house, this huge landscape installation. But they imagined that if you make it take 20 years to get from the bedroom to the bathroom, then you'll live forever.
I love that.
So the way to disrupt this idea of the floor plan in this open space and this resisting this speed and efficiency of modernity. In this way, to just take it to this kind of imagining. That's it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm gonna talk with you afterwards and write things down.
Thank you for your presentation. It's quite interesting for me to hear this word modernism over and over, because in my project or research project that I've been doing, I've also been looking at modernism, but then from a completely different angle, but from an architectural perspective as well. But I find it interesting that sometimes we use the word modernism in this very luxurious setting, but of course it also has been used in a kind of standardization and building very fast and prefab, and that wasn't always about the luxury of having a lot of they were also thinking about that, but it was also, in my research about social housing, also hiding a lot of things, providing healthy homes, but then actually expropriating other people. And I was thinking about this mapping and data and how, I mean, these are just random thoughts.
Yeah.
That it's, yeah, measuring, it's also often not showing things. And not showing actually human stories often. And yeah, these were just associations.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. And I'm so excited to be able to talk with you more about it too.
Yeah,
Thank
we can have a talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you so much. I forgot your name, sorry, online. Charlotte, nice meeting you. So I was just thinking if you've had any thoughts about this building. Because, you know, this is a building of Frits Perls, and it is a modernist building.
Yeah.
In which all these ideas take place, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's been really interesting, like just even seeing on the WhatsApp, like people being able to take photos of each other in studios or through the windows, or and the feeling of being able to, yeah.
Yeah. And
what are your thoughts about it?
No. I mean, David, is David here? David Habits? No, he's not here. He's been actually doing quite some nice things. His video is also on this interaction of what this academy used to be, a Catholic academy, making stained glass, and then it transitioned and sort of became this international academy. Yeah, and I was just wondering, how will we move forward to the future? What this kind of idea of transparency means, and how does one insert the kind of opaqueness that we are calling for, which is present in all of us, I suppose, in the things that we do or in the right that we have in order to be opaque, or not to be visible or to be. So I was just wondering, what could this building be? And maybe also in the context of all of those things that are happening here in people's projects, but also in the attempts of us, ourselves, to talk about modernism as a project. Also how it's connected to a much larger spectrum, maybe the colonial project, etc., etc. And what came to mind to me is the documentary Nostalgia de la Luz. You've seen it?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, we watched it together. Actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's this man who was then imprisoned in the Pinochet regime, I think for years, and he drew a map of the prison just by the sounds of it. And there is also a project of Lawrence Abu Hamdan, who's done exactly the same thing in the Syrian situation, where they had the prison where people were devoid of their senses, and he is interviewing them on how the prison looked like and what happened through sound. That might also be a nice angle.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's mine. Judita, what about the tectonic plates?
I know. Yeah.
We talked with Erin yesterday, so we had a long exchange already. Yeah, it's really interesting to see how completely different point of interest are, encountering, but from different lenses, and the idea of opacity, of darkness, of movement.
Yeah, it's something that we talked about that. That I think was particular. Well, everything we talked about was interesting to me, but there was the moment where we were talking about all of the different life that is living off of the vents and at the bottom of the seafloor. And I don't know if you would speak to that for a moment, your own interests in that.
Yeah, it's very fascinating, this ecology, that are flourishing in this. In complete darkness, what is are not based on photosynthesis but of chemosynthesis. And also the relation that we talked yesterday is about the spatial practices and architecture and the control, right? This for me is also really much around the control and the opposition of losing control. So I think, yeah, I found that there were so many points of contact.
Yeah.
Definitely. Coming from completely different interests.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Tell us more about this choice of taking us through the house and then also taking us through these visions of the seabed and the mapping process.
Yeah.
That within that is the answer to Hisham's question of opacity, and within that intersection we can unpack better these
Yeah.
and I'm also interested in
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, yeah. I think that, well, we were doing this residency in Maine in this house, and the kind of, and you jump in at any moment about this, but it was interesting because I didn't know anything about really the house before arriving, and it was this kind of disorienting experience of being in the house, because there's this kind of passageway that you see in the video where you move between these different spaces filled with light, and then you're in this kind of dark corridor. And simultaneously, we had begun conversations with an oceanographer, and who was doing this thing, and that was completely unrelated at the time. And then it was interesting to be having those conversations in relationship to this house and being so close to the water. And so it wasn't something, it felt very serendipitous in a way, like the overlap between yeah, they came together at a very particular moment. And so yeah, that's the first part of the question, how it started. What was the rest of the question? Sorry, Bruno.
That was the whole thing, actually.
That was everything?
If you could elaborate a bit more about how it started.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, Charlotte, do you want to jump in?
I actually can't hear very well.
Oh, okay. Oh, the question was just kind of the process also about like choosing to have us move through the corridor and being on the dolly, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of it was about trying to show different ways of looking and experiencing the space, because we were experiencing all these different ways, like looking at the ocean and sort of having these conversations with this oceanographer at the same time. And so thinking about that, and then we were looking through all these archives, trying to figure something out about these people, and we were like spending all this time in the house, moving around the house. And I think a lot of it was just trying to emulate all these different ways of moving, looking, and perspectives, and what we glean from that, I guess. And the fact that often it's quite opaque in the end, I guess.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like, to get to your question, I think there's something, I can't help but think about a previous project with botanists who were like thinking about the act of naming something, about like, you know, quote unquote discovering a species, right, and then giving it a name, and how whenever we see something, right, like and name it, there's both something that is so important to be seen, and then it's also so dangerous at times, or it can be so flattening to be seen. So just thinking about the tension, and I think actually it's interesting just thinking about Hamza's your talk just before, like thinking about like that actually it seemed like that was part of the conversation in some ways that you were having with the other writer about like things that like, you know, being the kind of like space between being like thinking about visibility and talking and being present in certain ways, and like how both of them can be important. So anyways, I guess I'm just thinking about that in relationship to this, that being seen is important and also being invisible as well.
Just to tap into what Hamza's about that scene, that also kind of,
yeah,
I was thinking about the same scene, that visibility is sort of also a political project, you know, and so she was actually saying something about opacity, and Hamza replied, yeah, but why can't you wear a niqab without having to motivate? And this is what's happening constantly, right? Yeah. But it's sort of a political project to point towards someone, because the other side of it is that you can't wear a niqab because the niqab takes away your freedom, because there's this idea of freedom that is resonating, and sort of back to the objectivity thing, that's an objective term, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the craziness of it, because nothing is objective.
Yeah.
Maybe, you know, so one cannot state any objective form of freedom. So one cannot also have the power to state objectiveness as something truthful. So there is this, and I was just wondering if we all, as participants, how do we think about this idea of modernity? How do we think, because we all have a feeling about it, right? And what would be the next step? And how could we sort of rethink or break a little bit this idea? Because the project of modernism is, in fact, has been part of what we've learned in school, has been part of our lives, has been part of the system that we are in. It's everywhere. It's in everything that we do. It's not only in how the building is constructed, right? The idea of visibility and transparency is also there. I mean, we've been talking a lot about transparency, but what does it mean, you know?
Yeah.
So I think it's hugely important to have these discussions.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was thinking about Hamja's performance and the video work as well so much throughout the whole conversation, and I wanted to bring up, we didn't end up having a question answering with yours, but that all of these questions, whether it's religion, whether it's race, whether it's gender or sexuality, all of these things were like being called to appear constantly, right? And then we're being told that by appearing, by being visible, somehow we're gonna find emancipation. And I see like there's a lot of people who are becoming very cynical about that. You know, as we have more trans people like engaging in the public sphere, it's not leading to emancipation. In many cases, it's leading to increases of violences on the streets. And that this calling to appear is almost like a trap. And what it's also doing is it's not only calling us to appear, it's calling us to appear in a way that is like a symbolic violence to ourselves, right? To reduce ourselves to a category that can then be, you know, fit within this ever-expanding category of modernity and the way that modernity categorizes and makes boundaries between things, right? And it's a violence to the multiplicity that is all of us, right? And that's what I think the power of opacity is, to refuse to be a single thing, is to refuse to be one category, one identifier, one marker. And I think that that is what the power of opacity can be and what should be reclaimed. And part of that is also refusing to appear and refusing this logic of visibility being emancipation in this sense. And that might be like a difficult thing to wrap our minds around, but it's like we can appear to our own communities, right? And we can appear in different ways to different communities. So yeah, just a thought about that.
No, and it's interesting what you were just saying, because it made me think about, Bruno, your question about the dolly or like the moving through the corridor. And I think that there's something that we've been having this kind of question as we've been making this about, like, is there any point in which like the kind of floor plan is revealed of the house, or do we always live in the space of a kind of disorientation that is happening, I think, with the dolly, right? Like you kind of, similarly to being in the house, the experience of being in the house, you never know exactly where you are, and it's hard to understand this kind of top-down looking that the house can offer with a floor plan, right? So that's just like something thinking about that question of transparency and opacity, like where do we land in the video? Yeah. So. Any other questions, thoughts? Yeah, we have dinosaurs to eat. Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate your time. See you.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Charlotte. It's nice to meet you. Well, tomorrow we have more. I should go here. Aaron, join me, please.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Tomorrow we have more. much, Aaron. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, everyone. Tomorrow we're here from 7.